What was the biggest scandal in your small town? The killers were also idiots for having dinner at the restaurant right before closing and tossing their leftover chicken bones in a garbage can with a fresh liner. The police preserved the refuse with the theory that they might have been eaten by the killers, and they were right. That crime effectively killed the Brown's Chicken franchise in Chicagoland, as there used to be a few dozen, but sales plummeted after the murders and they never recovered. I'm from a very small town in Canada. Very quiet, nothing big ever came up, and it was a fairly tight-knit community. One day, an explosion went off in an apartment building. A 23-year-old, single mother, who also happens to be a quadriplegic, was killed instantly. The case was eventually solved. The explosion was a gift-wrapped pipe bomb left by her former financial advisor. He squandered hundreds of thousands of dollars from her and was convicted for it. He was then released on bail and then left the bomb. Wild sh*t. Mayor and several city councilors were taking kickbacks and bribes from demolition/construction/cleaning companies for cleanup contracts after a hurricane, funded by FEMA. The companies would give the mayor and city councilors like a couple grand, then the company would get FEMA funds in the tens of thousands to clean up/destroy a hurricane-damaged property. Only the address given to FEMA and listed on the contract were fake, or already cleared, so the companies got paid to do nothing. This is why we can't have nice things. But seriously, corruption is the evil that plagues every system. Anti-corruption laws should be the most strict and stringent laws we have. We should be thinking, is that really a fair punishment just for that when there's a corruption case, be it a public figure like the mayor in your example, or someone in a publicly traded company or non-profit skimming money. Corruption is corruption and it should be stamped out at all levels. There was an anesthetist who worked at our local hospital and another hospital in a different town. He was rather well known among other doctors and known to be good at what he was doing. He only had a small problem with being addicted to painkillers and anesthetics. So to feed his addiction without getting caught, he shot up part of his patient's drugs before injecting the same needle into his patient. Thus went unnoticed until it was discovered that over 60 of his patients got infected with hepatitis. And that he was the source for it. He was fired and his license revoked as far as I know. But the hospital's image still suffered quite a bit. Shit like this makes me wonder. I had a dental experience approximate 5 years ago that I can't shake off. I had a filling, so he shot me up with Novocaine. He began to drill but I felt everything, so he gave me another shot. Still felt pain, so he gave me a third. 5 Novocaine shots later, which is apparently max doses, and I still felt pain. At that point, I was freaked out and in pain and threatened to walk with a hole in my tooth. He made me sit down to finish the tooth while I felt everything. I haven't been back to a dentist since and I need to. Where I grew up in the north of Scotland, there were a couple of Indian restaurants owned by 2 different men. One of the owners didn't like the fact that he was competing for business with the other guy, so he paid a local man to burn the other restaurant down one night. Not only did the local guy manage to leave his mobile phone at the crime scene, but he also singed his hair in the flames. He went into the local hairdresser's the next day to have it fixed, while the restaurant was still smoldering. Predictably, he ended up in prison, along with the owner who had paid him, and his restaurant was closed down. The other guy found another location and carried on trading. I lost him breaking up with my ex. They were friends before I met him and his BF. Would love to reconnect, but it's been years, yeah, no. Both of them were really great to be around and I do miss them now and again. But the ex is now in Texas or some shit, so maybe I'll hit him up. I've got a great friend group these days, so I don't feel like I'm missing anything. But those were some wild boys and a great time. Similar thing happened to a restaurant I used to work at. The owner I worked for sold the business, but not the building. New business owner took over, fired most of the staff, and the customers left with them. 3 months later the place burns down. Business owner got caught and went to jail for arson. The building owner sold the property to a developer, and now it's all condos. I hope George enjoyed his retirement. He was well into his 80s when I worked for him, and he was still there every morning working harder than anybody. A few members of a scummy local family broke into a bar, stole money, beer, and peanuts. When they went to leave, realized there was a drunk patron sleeping out back on a picnic table. They, thinking he was a potential witness, bashed his head in with a hammer, threw his body into the back of their truck, drove the truck through the old railroad trail and dumped the body in a swamp. They were caught almost immediately because there was a trail of blood and their truck was covered in DNA. All over some cash and beer. The local drunk got into an argument with another regular at a popular bar, pulled out a gun, and shot the other guy to death. But that's not the scandal. The guy who died was apparently really nice and well liked in the community. The others in the bar were able to disarm and restrain the assailant until the police arrived. When the sheriff got there, he just said, "Looks like you all need a few more minutes with him. I'll come back later." So everyone in the bar grabbed what they could find and ended up beating the shooter to death. The sheriff reported it as self-defense and the security tapes disappeared. But the bar was crowded, so the real story got out. There were a few attempts to reopen the case or charge the sheriff and some of the bar patrons, but they were all squashed pretty quickly. The really interesting detail, in my opinion, is that there were some pretty strong rumors that the drunk had been sleeping with the wife of the man he killed and that he'd been attacked first. So the original shooting may have been in self-defense. But because there was no camera footage and all the witnesses were involved in killing the drunk, there's no way of knowing the truth. I live in a small Russian city named Nalchik. In 2005, we were attacked by terrorists. Mobile groups of terrorists of 5 to 6 people, with a total number of about 200 people, armed with various small arms, including RPG-7 and RPD, enter Nalchik in cars from 2 directions. There are the first shootings between police officers and militants on the outskirts of the city. 14 civilians and 35 police officers and law enforcement agencies were killed. More than 240 people were injured, including 129 law enforcement officers. I was 5 months old then, and the stories of my parents are very surprising because now our city is very quiet and almost nothing happens. In 2000, a girl's body was found on the steps of the local middle school. She had been beaten, raped, strangled, and burned. The officer that arrived at the scene was a rookie officer. Since he was the first in the scene, the police department made him in charge of the case. The case was massively botched. The murder had shocked the community and a lot of people were talking. Several years later, the police marked it as a cold case. A local woman was doing her own detective work. She reached out to a journalist from the UK. The journalist flew to meet the woman and investigate the murder and missteps by the police. They uncovered a massive cover-up. The local police department was hostile towards the journalist and local. To the point that the state FBI branch had to get involved to protect the investigation. Due to the police department's terrorizing behavior, they ended up getting investigated by the FBI. Apparently they knew who had committed the crime. A local drug dealer, who was cozy with the police. He eventually was arrested and sent to prison for life. The police department got a slap on the wrist. The journalist went back to the UK and the local woman moved to a nearby city. Also, for anyone reading, this wasn't just a case of Mayfield Police Department, Kentucky, just looking the other way. A female officer took one of the witnesses home with her under protective custody for a few nights. Another officer pulled the murderer over the next day, his car reeking of gas, which he used to burn the body, and the officer decided to not follow up at all on the lead or report it to anyone. They sent that one female witness home days later without ever even getting even a statement from her. They were absolutely complicit in this murder and there are no two ways about it. This is all in addition to local PD outwardly harassing and threatening the local woman and the journalist, as you said. The burnouts agreed and took their money. The judge figured if the burnouts didn't hold up their end he would make sure they found guilty anyway. So they showed up in court in front of the prep's judge dad. They not only didn't plead guilty, they had a speeding ticket dated the same day and time as the time the bridge burned. But the speeding ticket was for 70 miles away. And since all three were minors, all three were named in the ticket report. The judge had no choice but to dismiss the case. And the parents of the preps weren't even mad because that was enough of an excuse to effectively end the whole investigation. Nobody got in trouble for it. It all just went away. The bridge was rebuilt, the placard was changed to say replica of a historic bridge, and for $10,000 those precious little boys didn't get a black mark in their records. My home county had a few historic covered bridges. They were quite the pride and joy of the area. Somebody burnt one down. Somebody else saw three young men do the deed. Now we all knew it was a trio of kids on my class. Like most schools we had cliques, two of which were the preps and the burnouts. The bridge burners were preps. One's dad was the county judge. One's mom was the primary real estate agent in town. This posed a dilemma. So the parents of the preps, including the judge, hatched a little plan. They gave three burnouts in my class $10,000 each, mid-1980s, and the promise of a light sentence of 6 months probation if they would plead guilty and take the fall. My friend's single male neighbor had a male friend who would show up about one Friday afternoon a month with his camping gear and fishing rods in the car. It was a Mercedes wagon, so the contents were visible to any passerby. The car would stay on the street until Sunday afternoon. Some rugged outdoorsmanship, eh? They never left the house. Not a scandal, but that story reminded me of this little setup. Too often. When I was a kid, I remember I was riding in my dad's work truck with him somewhere. The truck had, like, this secondary set of wheels that came down so it could drive on the tracks. We were driving through our town, which has a rail yard running right down the middle of it parallel to the main street. Some people were walking on the tracks. When my dad saw them, he flipped out. Pulled off the road as soon as he could, drove down the tracks to find them, and reamed them out, saying he'd already had to clean enough people off the tracks and send them to their mothers in pieces. I have never in my life seen him that angry, before or since. At my high school one year the whole basketball team held a kid down and took turns teabagging him. That was a pretty big thing. Not sure exactly what happened, but it was a big story around here for a while. Here is a bit of the story, but they don't go into details. A few years before that, my school was one of the first in an experimental program where they had an undercover female cop act as a student for most of the school year. She had a BF, and was even in the school yearbook. That was big as well. The only person in the whole school that knew was the superintendent. Here is the story on that. High Times even had a small article about it at the time. At the time I had heard she even had slept with one of the students as well and did take drugs, even though the article says the cop didn't. Not even a town, just a small village. Middle of the day and a bloke turns up to a house that is on the edge of the village park, shoots the occupier through the bedroom window. Had mates who were in the park at the time. Turns out it was drug related. Also the local barmaid stabbed her husband during an argument, turned round with a knife in her hand as he approached, he then fell backwards through the glass patio doors, was accidental and she was found not guilty. She was a lovely lady in her 60s. A couple of the cops beat up a mentally handicapped man who was wandering the streets acting outside societal norms. The rest of the town called for accountability. Police department tries to silence the leaders of the townspeople through intimidation and direct threats. Townspeople rally and oust the chief and a few of the worst police officers. Reform is completed. New PD is a little too hands-off at first and kids in the town ran rampant for a while. A balance is finally found and life returned to normal. I don't believe the man who was beat was ever helped on a personal level. This was the early to mid-80s. Freeport, New York. There was long a myth surrounding the local Chinese takeout spot on my corner. After generations of ignoring it, it made sense. Basically a takeout spot on the corner of Lillian Ave and Leonard Ave has these really good chicken wings. Thing is, they're really small. Like really small. When you take into account the actual size of a chicken wing vs the size of wings they serve you plus the fact that locally caught bird is more economically beneficial for the establishment plus the fact that we are talking about New York. It is in fact not at all hard to believe that they actually do catch, kill, and cook pigeon and serve it as chicken. Okay, not to be a bummer, but when I first moved into a small town everyone had shown me a video of a city council member having a complete meltdown at a meeting. She crawled under the table, started screaming, and needed to be dragged out. She was a caricature, and people loved making fun of her for it. I eventually got to know her and discovered she had literally miscarried that morning. No one had ever included that in the story retelling, they just used the video to make fun of her. You truly never know what is going on with people. More of a murder scandal, but about a mile down the road from my childhood home, very small town, we all knew each other. A man named Jimmy Pritchard killed his wife and stuffed her in the trunk of her car. He then took their daughter to find her. His daughter and I are the same age. This happened in '99, so we were 7 years old. He got away with it on lack of evidence. Later he also beat up a girlfriend and then possibly his boss. He also showed up at my aunt's house trying to get in her pants around the summer of 2001. My mom and I showed up just after. My mom, having no fear, called him out on killing her friend, and then my mom and my aunt beat the fuck out of him. Only thing not broken in the living room when the cops finally showed up was a ficus in the corner. As far as I know he's still a free man. Grew up in Ann Attleboro, Massachusetts and grew up Catholic. At my church, St. Mary's there was a priest named Father James Porter. He ends up going to jail for a very long time, admitted to abusing over 100 kids, and was convicted of molesting 28. It was national news and a very big story broken by the Boston Globe in the 90s. I was fortunate as he was an old man when I was an altar boy and never was touched. If I remember correctly, this was one of the first cases where the Vatican paid out a hefty sum to the victims. Pretty big news for small sleepy town.